Welcome, my friends. I hope you're doing well and, have a nice warm coffee or tea or, whatever your preference. And then, you know, either go for a nice walk down. We'll just go for a nice walk and listen, or if you have a comfy spot to listen to or take some notes or whatever. What I want to do today is continue the discussion from a couple weeks ago when we were looking at this idea of the biological origins of the human being and some of the kind of physical and cognitive aspects of that. And today we're going to be looking at how this translates once the baby's been born, once we enter infancy, and some of the development, especially from a biological, physical, cognitive brain, kind of almost like from a hardware perspective. And then next week we're going to be looking at how that then plays out in the social world. In chapter 4 is looking at social and emotional development in infancy. Glad you're here. Hope that you're having a decent week. I think I might have already said that, but let's get into it. So I'm going to just put up all the slides and all the points and then kind of talk for a bit. You know how to do this. Okay, so cephalosaccadal, here's your new word for the day if you haven't heard this before. It's like you say to your loved one, oh, you're looking really good cephalosacadally. It's probably not a great line to use at a party or anything, but that means basically head to tail, top to bottom. And it's this idea that the baby doesn't just grow randomly, it sort of grows head down. Two words characterize growth during the prenatal development and in early infancy. In the cephalosaccadal period, in that word, the first time I learned it took a ton of time to practice. You just say it a bunch of times and then it's easy. Cephalosaccadal, just head to tail. And if you're like, what do you mean tail? It's like tailbone. And it means, yeah, head to tail. Cephalino is head, and then tail is caudal, like the Ncaudal. That doesn't necessarily matter. Head to tail, head to tail. This growth pattern explains why the head occupies an extraordinary proportion of the newborn's body. Physical growth and differentiation, so things starting to do different things, of features gradually work their way down from the top to bottom. Shoulder, middle trunk, and so on and so on. So basically top down. So again, this is kind of saying this slide and the next slide I'm going to be making the points that we don't just grow randomly, we sort of grow top down and middle out. And the word for top down is cephalosaccadal, head to toe, cephalosaccadal. I'm going to say it an annoying amount of times just so that it kind of hardwires for you. Cephalosaccadal means head to toe. The baby's not just growing randomly in different spots, it's basically going like this and like this. This pattern occurs even within the head, as the top parts of the head, the eyes and brain, grow faster than the lower parts, such as the jaw. Likewise, infants see objects before they can control their torso. So think of that even control-wise. So it's like they can think of what my daughter right now can control. So my daughter right now, if you can hear her crying, probably can't. My wife's up there with her. And she's, a couple days over 2 months. So she can, with her eyes, she can start to track. She can control higher in her head earlier than she can control like lower in her body. So that cephalosaccadal seems to have relevance for function even, which is fascinating. Likewise, yeah, infants can see objects before they can control their torso. They can use their hands before they can walk. Cephalosaccadal. Okay, so I noticed that when I rewatched that last slide, I switched my definition midway. So when I'm saying cephalosaccadal, it's head to tail. And then I started saying head to toe just because that's such like a common saying. And it sort of means the same thing, but basically that it's starting high and going down and starting in the middle and going out. But for your notes, please have the idea of head to tail because that's specifically what it means. And then the second word, proximodistal. So proximodistal. So you can kind of see the word distance there, and you can also see the word proximity in that, and modal. It's kind of in the middle, so it kind of means like, basically it just means from the middle out. So things like your heart, and you can kind of see that when you look at your body. It's like a lot of your important stuff is sort of on this T of like your main central organs down to probably your sex organs and up to your, well, to your brain. Proximodistal means near to far. The pattern refers to a sequence in which growth starts at the center of the body and moves towards extremities. For example, infants can control muscles in their trunk and arms before they can control their actual specific hands, which we would call fine motor skills. And they can use their whole hand before they can use their specific fingers. So they'll be able to go like this before they can pick up. So it's interesting that it has relevance in relation to hand in relation to the rest of the body, and even within the hand to the difference between the overall hand and the fingers of the hand. Oh, this is more fun standing up. This feels like, oh man, it feels like, not to be emotional or anything, but like how it used to be. Okay, next slide. Okay, now Charlotte, now we just gotta nail the verbal part. So here's my partner in crime for this slide, Charlotte. We're gonna go through this checklist and see where she's at. So she's about a couple days over 2 months. Head lift, doable. You can do that. You can move your head a bit. Rolling, no. Stooping. So stooping, you can kind of see as I go across the pictures, that's like being able to lift your bum up. No, definitely not. Sitting, everyone knows that one. Can't do that yet. You can be sat up, but it doesn't have the sophisticated strength of the spine yet. Sitting, yeah, I did that. Standing, climbing, walking. So you can see these are these gross motor, meaning big level changes, right? So we'll contrast that in a second with fine motor, meaning like the ability to pick something up with, like, the word I'm thinking of is dexterity. It's like gross motor is the bigger stuff. Climbing, walking, standing, supporting your weight, basically. All right, that's Charlotte's little cameo. So if we look at this idea, okay, so developmental cognitive neuroscience, if you look at what that kind of would mean, that, well, it's looking at how our development and how basically the neuroscience, so what's going on in our brain at almost a hardware level, how that's affecting our thinking, our cognitive system, our actual functional operating system, and how that's being influenced by developmental factors. Developmental cognitive neuroscience explores how the brain develops and how the developmental changes in neural activity affect cognitive development. So how the easier way of saying that is how actual physical changes in the brain change how the brain works. Cognition, how it works, because cognition. That there's this extensive brain development from birth throughout infancy. Lots of brain development during the pregnancy period, but there's also extensive brain development throughout infancy. Right by the time the baby's born, the brain is about 25% of the weight of an adult's brain. By the time the child's 2, it's about 75%. And this is when the child enters the social world. Interactions with the environment. This is so interesting. It's what's interacting with the environment. You'd say that, well, the child. But what do you mean? The child's foot's interacting with the environment? Well, I guess somewhat in terms of the sensory nerves. So the sensation and the touch. It's the brain, though. It's like this idea that, like, it's actually this relationship starting to exist between the neurons, the hardware of the child's brain, and their outside world. And sometimes that outside world's mom, and sometimes that outside world is strangers, and sometimes it's sights and sounds and things they hear, and the breast milk that they're drinking. And it's like this is all creating them. It's so mind-blowing when you step back and, you know, if you can look at it from a certain perspective of, it's the magic of life, really. I've said that a few times, and because the brain's developing so rapidly in infancy, the infant's head should be protected from falls and other injuries. The baby should never be shaken. But the baby's brain doesn't simply get larger. Through interactions with the environment, individual neurons and connections are shaped. And this is what allows for things like perception, language, complicated thought. So if in your notes you can have this idea of a neuron, that a neuron is a nerve cell, but it's a specific type of nerve cell. And these are nerve cells that are specifically handling information processing. Okay, and we're going to sort of look at different aspects of what we're actually talking about with the neuron. But the first point I kind of want you to have in your notes is that it's a nerve cell that handles processing information, and how it actually processes that information. So if you look at it as a computer, it's not like the metaphor breaks down, because how your brain does it is in this biochemical way. It sends these electrical, and that's similar to computer, but these chemical signals, right? And that your brain is this electrical chemical system, which is why shock to the brain has such profound influence, right? And why it's like so unrecommended except in very specific situations, because it has this huge effect on the brain. And I'm sure you've all heard of what electroshock is, but the reason why your brain is sensitive to that is because your brain has a lot of electrical processes going on and a lot of chemical processes going on, which is also why it's, you know, susceptible to chemicals. That's saying the least, right? But the idea for this slide is just to get this I got a little bit off track there, but the point is that a neuron is a nerve cell that processes information, and it does that through electrical and chemical messages that it sends. And so every neuron has, if you look at that picture for a sec, every neuron has like parts of it that are involved with sending messages and parts of it that are involved with receiving messages that are being sent to it. So it's almost like it's got like an in and an out phone. It's got an outgoing mail and an ingoing mail function. And that's actually an interesting way of looking at it. And then we'll get into, well, what do we mean sending between? And right, you have the numbers, when we talk about how many of these there are and stuff, the numbers are mind-blowing. So, but at the base, it's this idea that it's messaging, right? When we're talking about these, when we talk about neurotransmitters and all this stuff, what are we talking about? That there's this electrical chemical exchange happening in the brain. And we're just going to kind of, over the next half hour or so, just talk about some of the language around that. So I have a couple videos I'm going to show too today, because what I like to do when it gets pretty biological like this is I'll try to give as clear as I can definitions for your notes, and then I'll try to say some stuff or examples or whatever, what I'm doing as the spoken component, to like kind of help you understand or remember or whatever, and then I'll try to show you through the pictures on the slide and also some of the animations I'm going to include, so that you can kind of, for the more visual learners, and just for the aspect that we all have aspects of visual learners. It's not like you're one learning type, but okay. The developing brain. So this is the idea that I was mentioning a little bit ago, that each neuron has the ability to have ingoing and outgoing mail, and we would call the outgoing mail the axons, and the incoming mail pile the dendrites, right? So you can see like there's these dendrites, or unfortunately my picture's kind of covering it, but there's a square there. Maybe I'll move this video over to the side, but the blue square, you can see just at the bottom I have the word dendrite written, but you can already see it on the slide. It's one of the blue words. And so you can see how that looks like tree branches, or almost like antennas. Maybe that's a better way to view it, like an old school TV antenna. And it's like it's ready to accept messages coming in from the outside, and that's sort of represented by the orange arrow. And then the axons are what's the outgoing mail. It's carrying messages out, again through I was going to say bioelectric and biochemical processes. This is the old webcam. I don't use it anymore. But so it has a camera on the front, right? Obviously, an ability to take in technical information, and then it sends an electrical current message to the end of the USB that is connected to, you know, theoretically a computer, right? And there's if you were to cut this plastic open, there's obviously a wire there that allows for that to travel, right? But so why is there plastic on the outside? And the answer is because, well, the integrity of that message being sent demands that that channel is insulated in a protective way, so that both the wiring doesn't break down in this example, and so that it's not damaged, and so that the message can actually be sent correctly. And that same idea, get rid of this metaphor over, the same idea is true with the neurons in the brain, right? So if you think of it as like the arm of the neuron, so if you basically just think of a tree branch and then you put like insulation around that branch, or better example is the copper wire, and then you put plastic around it. And that plastic around it is for protection. It's myelin, it's a sheath. What's a sheath? If you have a sword and you put the sword in the sword's case, the real word for a sword's case is a sheath, right? So a sheath is a protective case. It's like myelin is just what it's made out of. Myelination is the process in which this protective layer is added to the outside of the neuron. A process encasing the actual axon of the neuron, the part that's sending information. So it actually is protected. It's this coat. I'm going to show a video on it in just a sec, just trying to explain it verbally. And that's actually super important. So if you picture all these electrical wires, that's not the best way of thinking of it, but all these electrical processes, a good way of thinking about it is, one problem is when there's a breakdown of myelin sheath in conditions like multiple sclerosis, where actually some of the neurons touch where they're not supposed to. And a lot of what causes MS is issues with the myelin sheath. And so when that's not functioning properly, we see that it has all these very significant consequences. So myelin sheath is this idea of this, it's actually like a fat cells that insulate them, help keep electrical signals strong, help them travel faster. Right, so you know how if you're like, oh, I've driven to this place 100 times, I got it hardwired in your brain. What do you mean when you say that? What you really mean is that myelin sheath has formed around that connection. It's hardwired. That's what that word means. In a certain sense, right? So myelin is sheath. Myelination, the process of that being formed, and then the sheath is just what you're kind of calling that protective outer layer. Remember the metaphor I was using before of the plastic outside of your cord, outside of the copper wire of your cord.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss myelin. Myelin is an insulating layer that surrounds the axons of neurons. Composed primarily of lipids, myelin helps to prevent action potentials, which are the electrical signals that travel along axons, from decaying due to electrical current leaking out through the axonal membrane. Myelinated axons thus conduct action potentials more quickly and efficiently than unmyelinated axons, and because of this, many neurons in the nervous system are myelinated. Myelin does not cover an axon fully. Instead, there are intermittent gaps in the myelin where the axon is exposed to extracellular space. These gaps are called nodes of Ranvier, and the sections of myelin that are adjacent to the nodes of Ranvier are called internodes. The nodes of Ranvier are rich in sodium channels, which open in response to an action potential traveling down an axon, allowing positive sodium ions to rush in. This influx of sodium ions rejuvenates the action potential and helps to prevent it from dying out as it proceeds along the axon. Because the nodes of Ranvier are not myelinated, however, the action potential slows down at each node and speeds up as it travels along the myelinated internodes. This gives the appearance that an action potential is jumping from node to node, which is known as saltatory conduction. Myelin is formed by glial cells, but the particular type of glial cell responsible for myelinating axons is different in the peripheral and central nervous systems. In the peripheral nervous system, glial cells called Schwann cells form myelin. Each Schwann cell wraps around one segment of an axon many times to form one internode. In the central nervous system, oligodendrocytes form myelin. One oligodendrocyte can produce dozens of internodes on multiple axons. Because myelin is white, myelinated axons appear white and make up what is known as the white matter of the brain. We can see the importance of myelin to healthy neural functioning when we look at diseases where myelination is disrupted. In multiple sclerosis, for example, deficiencies in myelin disrupt neuronal communication, resulting in a variety of physical and psychiatric symptoms.
I should make this note too that I realized that this is the first chapter that there's sort of a quiz attached with, and this is pretty biology based, and some of you might be a little bit intimidated. If you didn't, I know some of you are coming from more of a biology background than others. So what I wanted to say though is it's not like on the test you're going to be asked to like draw diagrams and stuff like that. I want you to generally know what a dendrite is and what an axon is and what neurotransmitters are and what a synapsis means. But I'm going to be going on kind of rants and showing videos and stuff like that. I want you to kind of focus on what you're seeing on the slides specifically, and then everything else is kind of supportive, okay? So you don't have to be kind of scrambling to write down all my rants or everything that's in a video, because some of the videos are like 90% what we're talking about with a little twist, and I'm just not always able to find a perfect one. So a neurotransmitter means that, now think about this, these axons, right? So this outgoing male, the part of the myelin sheath's developing on, you can see in that picture like how that arm's extending all the way down the myelin sheath, you can see at the top there. Then you see it kind of branches out into these kind of finger looking or branch looking extensions, and at the end of each of these extensions is a place that's called the terminal button. You don't need to know that necessarily, but what it is, it's basically the place where it releases a chemical. So if we're saying that like there's these chemical exchanges happening in the brain, what are we really saying? We're saying, well, there's a chemical over here that's being released and shared to over here, and it actually, that process is called a neurotransmission. It's a transmission. Think of what a transmission means in terms of like radio. It's like I have a new radio show. We transmit live from Kitchener every Friday night. That'd be cool, but what's transmit mean? I put out a signal, someone else can receive it. So a neurotransmission is a signal that's sent and received. So these terminal buttons are just a word, right? That just means the end of the axon where chemicals are released, all right, and then picked up by the other side. And we call that releasing and pick up a synapsis, because it kind of like, it's like, here's the one, here's the other one, this one releases, this one connects. We'd say that what's that mean when it goes from one to one? We call that a synapsis. Right, that the synapsis is referring to that gap between neurons where that information actually passes through. So synapsis is, if you're studying that neurosynapsis, you're studying that gap between one and the other, and how it goes from one to the other, and how one accepts, and how to, right, with certain like medications, you're trying to maybe affect that process, certain types of reuptakes, which again, we're getting a little bit too much into the science of it, but basically what I want you to know is this idea that when we're saying that we're sending chemical messages in the brain, what are we really saying? Or even electrical messages. We're saying that things are connecting. And wiring is a metaphor that has some sense. Now, the complexity of the brain is where the wiring metaphor breaks down. Right. I hope this is kind of making sense. I'm going to keep going on this because it's kind of built. So there's sort of an argument to be made that, I'll just read this. So neurons change in two very significant ways during the first year of life. First, there's myelination, which we talked about, the process of encasing axons with fat cells, which begins prenatally and continues through childhood, even into adolescence. Second, connectivity amongst the neurons increases. Okay, so the actual quality of the connections get better, which we're calling myelination. So this like hardwiring increases, and the amount that those are all being interconnected is increasing. The connectivity or connectedness, amount of connectedness. Second, connectivity amongst neurons increases, creating a new neural pathways. New dendrites grow, connections amongst dendrites increase, and synaptic connections between axons and dendrites proliferate. They're just all over the place. That's just, you know, if you're trying to write that word for word, he's basically just saying that, it's basically saying like just there's this explosion of activity where myelination speeds up neural transmissions. The expansion of dendritic connections facilitates the spread of neural pathways in infant development. It's like that's basically what a growing brain is. This synaptic density idea of like neurons getting stronger and getting hardwired and getting super connected. And we looked at the other time that that's what makes the human brain so interesting. It's not just the size, it's not just the size ratio, it's this neuroconnectivity aspect. Researchers have discovered an intriguing aspect of synaptic connections. Nearly twice as many of these connections are made as will ever be used. Think about that for a sec. So an interesting finding is that you make way more connections than you're ever going to need. And so as you get older, your brain actually starts to prune. We call it neural pruning, right? Where some people call it cognitive pruning, but I think, but yeah, neural pruning, the pruning of neural connections, the sharpening of your brain, cutting out the old roots that aren't as fast as the best root that you've hardwired. The connections that are used become stronger and survive, while the unused ones are replaced by other pathways or disappear. In the language of neuroscience, these connections are pruned. I should have just kept reading. That's from Selman's research from 2016. How complex are these neural connections? In an analysis by DeHaan in 2015, it was estimated that each of the billions of neurons is connected to as many as 1,000 other neurons. Okay, so this number is huge, right? So you're saying there's billions times thousands. So we're getting into numbers that are in the trillions by definition, right? So like 1,000 billion is a trillion. If you had 1,000 piles of $1 billion, that's literally what $1 trillion is. So this metaphor of looking at synaptic density as what you'll sometimes hear cognitive psychologists call it, blooming and pruning, as if it's like this blooming like a flower. Think of like a flower or a bonsai tree that blooms, and then you prune it to make it look perfect and to help the growth. Or you could picture like a cherry tree or an apple tree too. And this blooming and pruning varies considerably by brain region. In the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain where higher level thinking and self-regulation occur, the peak of overproduction occurs at just over 3 years of age. It's not until middle or late adulthood that they develop full synaptic density. And you'll hear people say, like, one reason that people take less risks when they're older is because in your early 20s, your prefrontal cortex fully develops, and then you take less risks. What are people really talking about? They're talking about synaptic density. When they say like this part of your brain is fully formed, what's that mean? It means, well, myelination and connectivity. It's synaptic density. Synaptic density is believed to be an important indication of the extent of connectivity between neurons. The pace of myelination also varies. So think about this, the process of like hardwiring those cells also varies in different parts of the brain. For example, it seems like our brain prioritizes everything related to vision more than it does for things related to hearing. Interesting, right? Myelination for visual pathways occurs rapidly after birth, completed by 6 months. Auditory myelination is not completed until about 5 years. Right? So visual myelination is completed at about 6 months. Why? Because you can, if you're asking from an evolutionary perspective, because of the priority adaptive functionality of vision, that for our ancestors it was so core to surviving. So I realized here I read the points in my notes for the last slide and this slide with the last one. So you've already heard me say this, but I'd like you to have some of these in your notes. This idea that it's this expansion of dendritic connection, which again, it's like, if you can see through the language, it's not that difficult. It's like basically saying that all these nerve cells in the brain send and receive, right? So we're either talking about sending out, which is the axons, or receiving, which is the dendrites, right? So dendritic connections just mean there's all these branches reaching out looking for connections. And that reaching out, that expansion of dendritic connections is actually part of what we're saying when we're saying that the child's mind is expanding. This is like the physical, biological words for it. That we're seeing nearly twice as many of these connections as made as ever will be. And this is when I went on that idea of like pruning, right? That the used connections become strong and survive, that unused ones become replaced through this process of cognitive pruning. I have a sip of coffee with my nipsing friends while I leave this slide out for a sec because, I read the point on the last slide. always keep the slide long enough so it's good for note taking. All right, next slide. The forebrain and the cerebral cortex. Okay, so you can look at the brain. This is fun, I must say. I really like this class. You've been very nice to me, and you know, these are tough times, and I don't know, I was overwhelmed there by a little bit of the fact that it's fun to be having fun. I enjoy this topic. I hope that it's interesting to you, and it's kind of fun. Like Evie's at school, and Julie and Charlotte's sleeping upstairs. Julie's just watching a movie, and it's like I'm down here talking about stuff that's super interesting. It's like, it's nice to be appreciative sometimes, and I don't know, I appreciate all of you. So anyways, that's enough of that. Don't want to be all emotional on you, but no, you do add value to my life. So changes in brain structure. So this idea of like, there's what we can call the forebrain. So there's the hindbrain and midbrain and forebrain, and you can kind of look at them developmentally where they fit in. But for the purposes here, I want to talk about this thing called the cerebral cortex. So the forebrain, or this strong big part of the brain, right? So if you look at like the midbrain is like the back here, right? So the forebrain is like you, and I mean you because it's what you identify with psychologically, and this is and then the cerebral cortex kind of covers the forebrain like a wrinkled cap. So think about that. It's like, that's a weird way of saying it. It's like a cap that goes on the top, but that the cap that goes on the top of the brain is wrinkled. So you see the forebrain, right? You see the hindbrain, the midbrain, the forebrain, and then it seems like on top of that there's this wrinkly thing, and it's like, why is the brain so wrinkled? It's actually super complicated. Why? And it actually, the wrinkles and the grooves actually increase surface area and increase the amount of room that things can function. It's actually one of the most brilliant designs in the universe, and you know, the smartest piece of tissue that we know of has these two halves, these hemispheres, half spheres, based on, there's these cortical ridges and valleys, and cortical ridges and valleys, and scientists distinguish these in these four main areas of the brain called lobes. That took me like a bunch of times because I kept messing up a couple of the words. It's weird how I shouldn't talk so much about the process, but it's funny how when you're doing presentations, how some slides are kind of more straightforward and some are more difficult, even when the language isn't necessarily all that much harder. But it's the sequencing and stuff. So let's get into the lobes of the brain. Hope you're enjoying it. And you digital classroom. Next slide.
The cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the brain. It is primarily made up of gray matter that is extensively folded, forming ridges called gyri and grooves called sulci. The folding substantially increases the surface area of the cerebral cortex, making room for more neural components. Most of the cerebral cortex in humans is classified as neocortex, which is so named because it is thought to have appeared relatively recently in vertebrate evolution. Neurons in the neocortex are typically arranged in 6 layers, which are distinguished from one another by differences in cell type and cell density. The rest of the cerebral cortex is made up of either allocortex, which has a more variable pattern of layering, or mesocortex, which is a transition area between the neocortex and allocortex. Although attempts to functionally subdivide the cerebral cortex tend to oversimplify its functions, one common approach is to divide the cortex into sensory areas, motor areas, and association areas. Sensory areas receive information related to sensation and include regions like the primary somatosensory cortex, which processes information about sensations like touch, pain, and temperature, primary visual cortex, and primary auditory cortex, as well as other areas devoted to sensations like olfaction, taste, and the vestibular senses. The motor areas of the cerebral cortex are involved with movement and include regions like the primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, and supplementary motor cortex. Association areas are involved in the integration of information from multiple brain regions. This integration can do things like add complexity to sensory perceptions or facilitate higher cognitive processes. For example, the association areas in the parietal cortex are thought to be involved with aspects of attention and perceptual awareness. and association areas in the frontal cortex are linked to complex processes like planning, impulse control, and self-awareness.
So in terms of the lobes of the brain, sometimes you hear people talk in this kind of language, and they're talking about like the frontal and the occipital, like the visual center, and the temporal and the parental lobes as these like 4 different areas. And it's important to realize that regardless if we're talking about the frontal or the parental, that all 4 of these lobes are found in the cerebral cortex of each hemisphere, meaning that there's a frontal lobe on both sides. There's an occipital is how it's supposed to say. That's a tough one. Occipital. But it just means it's this back part. Massive processing center. And that this idea that there's so just so it's not confusing in the next video, if you didn't know this, that there's 4 lobes, but they exist on both sides and they're not completely identical. It says they're either in anatomy or in function, which just means they don't necessarily look like carbon copies of each other, and they also don't necessarily do the exact same thing. So it's almost like they have hardware and software differences.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss the lobes of the brain and some major landmarks of the brain surface that can be seen from a lateral view. The brain is made up of 2 halves, known as cerebral hemispheres. When looking at the brain from a lateral view, which just means looking at it from the side, we will only see one cerebral hemisphere, but the landmarks I will point out are found on both cerebral hemispheres. The surface of the cerebral hemispheres is covered with a thick layer of brain tissue known as the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is folded to create more surface area, forming these ridges, known as gyri, and grooves, known as sulci. This large sulcus is known as the central sulcus. It divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. This sulcus is known as the Sylvian fissure, and it separates the temporal lobe from the rest of the cerebral hemisphere. The occipital lobe is found at the back of the brain, but it doesn't have such a clear division separating it from the rest of the brain. There are certain functions associated with the lobes, but any short description of these functions is oversimplified, as each is involved in many different processes. The frontal lobes are important for movement and higher order cognition like rational thought, decision-making, and planning. This area in front of the central sulcus is known as the precentral gyrus, and it is essential for motor control as it is the location of the primary motor cortex. The parietal lobes are important for processing of sensory information and are involved in attention and our representation of the space around us. This area in the parietal lobe, the postcentral gyrus, contains the primary somatosensory cortex and is where the sense of touch is processed. The temporal lobe is involved in processing auditory signals and also is important in aspects of learning and memory. The occipital lobes contain major visual processing areas of the brain like the primary visual cortex.
Okay, lateralization. Now think of this. I almost pressed it too many times. If you're doing pre-recorded PowerPoints and you're doing your slides at all that order, you got to be careful, because if you press forward one too many times, it goes to the next one and then it begins recording. So if you had something previously recorded on that slide, it cuts over it. And so I try to prevent doing that, but it gives you one blank round. It's like you go starts before birth, newborns, may reflect early auditory experience. I pressed it one extra time and it didn't do it if I pressed it one more. So just remember, because remember, PowerPoint is a powerful video creation tool. I'm just recording myself straight into PowerPoint with just a basic webcam and, a Blue Yeti mic, which is about, $120. It's pretty cheap. It's like if you get a Blue Yeti mic and even just the audio is the biggest thing, right? Your whatever, and I'm not saying this is demanded for our projects or anything, but I'm just saying for if you're interested in making videos in the future, like the audio is probably the biggest thing people really notice when audio is off. It's why when the lip syncing's a bit off in like a movie or something, it really bugs you, the viewer usually. Whereas like most webcams are going to be fine. It doesn't have to be, you don't need to see my bald head in 4K. Like if we can, even standard definition's fine. Okay, how did I get on that long point? Sorry about that. I should maybe start the slide over, but I'm going to roll with it because, life's short and no one's perfect. Lateralization is this idea that basically a lot of the times when you're seeing depictions of the brain, you're seeing actually cross sections. You're basically seeing it from the side and split in half. So a lot of the times we're looking at the brain not from this above view, right? But you're usually looking at it at the side. And lateralization is looking at this idea of specialization and how function specialization can happen differently in the hemispheres. Lateralization, I'm going to go to my note here, is the specialization of function in one hemisphere or the other. At birth, the hemispheres of the cerebral cortex have already started to specialize. Have already started to specialize. Newborns show greater electrical activity in the left hemisphere than in the right hemisphere when listening to speech, for example. Of course, early speculation of a specialization of the left hemisphere might reflect this early auditory experience. As we'll see later, the development of the developing fetus, also is learning about the auditory world during the last trimester of pregnancy, as researchers continue to explore the degree to which each is involved in various aspects of thinking, feeling, and behavior. So this different sides doing different parts. And probably the best example of this would be looking at something complex like language. Like, it seems like there's a part of our brain that processes language and another part that sort of adds what each individual word means so we can understand it. So it's almost, I'll just read this here. The most extensive research on brain lateralization is focused on language. Speech and grammar are located in the left hemisphere for most people, but some aspects of language, such as the appropriate language to use in different contexts. So think about that. So it's like maybe language is on this side, but when that joke will actually work in a social situation is on this side. So I'll just start that sentence again. The most extensive research on brain lateralization is focused on language. Speech and grammar are located in the left hemisphere for most people, but some aspects of language, such as appropriate use of different contexts and the use of metaphor or humor, involve the right hemisphere, and that's from research from Moore, Brendel, and Feitz in 2014. Thus, language is not controlled exclusively by the left brain as initially thought. Right? So that's so fascinating. It's like, yeah, okay, so language is mainly here, but when it's kind of strategic to use certain metaphors, or when you can tell you're losing the crowd, or when you can tell it's a good time for a joke, it's like, that's a different system, and those have the coordination between them, the link, the sync is so key. For most neuroscientists agree that complex functions such as reading, performing music, creating art, are the outcome of communication between both sides of the brain. So the early experiences in the brain, and the idea here is, and this kind of pulls us back to this nature-nurture thing that you'll see in psychology courses. It's like no matter how hard we try, we keep coming back to the same pathway, and it's like nature-nurture again, and it's because any complex examination of something is going to come back to this point of like, well, there's a genetic component, but that genetic component exists within a social context, and before birth, genes are mainly directing how the baby's brain starts to establish its basic wiring. It's starting to form its neural connections. We called it that synaptic density earlier. But then once that baby's born, this is the nurture, it's born into an environment, and that environment guides brain development then, right? And we all already know that, right? You understand that a baby needs stimulation. It needs people to play with it. It needs to be held when it's upset. How the quality of the environment has a huge effect on the baby's development. Sight, sound, smells, touch, language, eye contact all shape these neural connections in the brain. This developing neural connections, right? Neurodensity, mind, brain. I'm just gonna annoy everyone by using those two words interchangeably. Obviously, mind and brain is a different thing, but it's interesting to say, what do you mean when you say that? That one's like physically what it is, but the mind's somehow not physical. But even though we know thoughts have a bioelectrical physicalness to them. Anyways, love this class. Next slide. So this next term, you know obviously what construction means, right? To construct something, to build it, to like a construction worker builds things, and neuroconstruction, brain construction, and this brain construction view. And this brain construction view is this kind of applied idea of nature meets nurture, and biological processes in our environment. So again, biological processes, just another way of saying nature. Environmental experiences, just another way of saying nurture, interact to influence people's brains' development. So it's this idea that, you're born into a world. You and your world both matter. The development of the brain and the child's cognitive development are closely linked. So now that almost sounds obvious, but it's actually not obvious. It's saying like the development of their brain system and their brain function are directly connected. That the brain's development influences or constrains, so either makes them more or less likely to be able to use certain cognitive abilities, to be able to think certain ways. And that's kind of why Piaget was so groundbreaking. He's probably the most important developmental psychologist specifically. He said kids have completely different ways of thinking. It's not a more or less thing. It's not quantitative. It's completely different shifts in style. Or the word he would use is, he would say, stages of cognitive development. There's, sensory motor, pre-operational, formal operational, concrete operational, but just this idea of that there's these different levels.
You are one of the seminal figures in the history of neural networks at the intersection of cognitive psychology and computer science. What to you has, over the decades, emerged as the most beautiful aspect about neural networks, both artificial and biological?
The fundamental thing I think about with neural networks is how they allow us to link biology with the mysteries of thought. And, when I was first entering the field myself in the late 60s, early 70s, cognitive psychology had just become a field. There was a book published in 67 called Cognitive Psychology. And the author said that, the study of the nervous system was only of peripheral interest. It wasn't going to tell us anything about the mind. And I didn't agree with that. I always felt, oh, look, I'm a physical being. From dust to dust, ashes to ashes, and somehow I emerged from that.
So that's really interesting. So there was a sense with cognitive psychology that in understanding the sort of neuronal structure of things, you're not going to be able to understand the mind. And then your sense is, if we study these neural networks, we might be able to get at least very close to understanding the fundamentals of the human mind.
Yeah. I used to think, or I used to talk about the idea of awakening from the Cartesian dream. So Descartes, thought about these things, right? He was walking in the gardens of Versailles one day, and he stepped on a stone, and a statue moved. And he walked a little further, stepped on another stone, and another statue moved. And he, why did the statue move when I stepped on the stone? And he went and talked to the gardeners, and he found out that they had a hydraulic system that allowed the physical contact with the stone to cause water to flow in various directions, which caused water to flow under the statue and move the statue. And he used this as the beginnings of a theory about how animals act. And he had this notion that these little fibers that people had identified that weren't carrying the blood, were these little hydraulic tubes that if you touch something, there would be pressure, and it would send a signal of pressure to the other parts of the system, and that would cause action. So he had a mechanistic theory of animal behavior. And he thought that the human had this animal body, but that some divine something else had to have come down and been placed in him to give him the ability to think. Right? So the physical world includes the body in action, but it doesn't include thought, according to Descartes. Right? And so the study of physiology at that time was the study of sensory systems and motor systems and things that you could directly measure when you stimulated neurons and stuff like that. And the study of cognition was something that, was tied in with abstract computer algorithms and things like that. But when I was an undergraduate, I learned about the physiological mechanisms. And so when I'm studying cognitive psychology as a first-year PhD student, I'm saying, wait a minute, the whole thing is biological, right?
You had that intuition right away. That seemed obvious to you.
Yeah.
Isn't that magical, though, that from just a little bit of biology can emerge the full beauty of the human experience? Why is that so obvious to you?
Well, obvious and not obvious at the same time. And I think about Darwin in this context too, because Darwin knew very early on that none of the ideas that anybody had ever offered gave him a sense of understanding how evolution could have worked. But he wanted to figure out how it could have worked. That was his goal. And he spent a lot of time working on this idea and reading about things that gave him hints and thinking they were interesting, but not knowing why, and drawing more and more pictures of different birds that differ slightly from each other and so on, and then he figured it out. But after he figured it out, he had nightmares about it. He would dream about the complexity of the eye and the arguments that people had given about how ridiculous it was to imagine that could have ever emerged from some sort of, unguided process, right? Yeah. That it hadn't been the product of design. And so he didn't publish for a long time, in part because he was scared of his own ideas. He didn't think they could possibly be true.
Yeah.
But then, by the time the 20th century rolls around, we all, we understand that or many people understand or believe that evolution produced, the entire range of animals that there are. Descartes' idea starts to seem a little wonky after a while, right? Like, well, wait a minute. There's the apes and the chimpanzees and the bonobos and, they're pretty smart in some ways, so what? Oh, somebody comes up, there's a certain part of the brain that's still different. They don't, there's no hippocampus in the monkey brain. It's only in the human brain. Huxley had to do a surgery in front of many, many people in the late 19th century to show to them that there's actually a hippocampus in the chimpanzee's brain, So the continuity of the species is another element that, contributes to this sort of, idea that we are ourselves a total product of nature. And that to me is the magic and the mystery, how nature could actually, give rise to organisms that have the capabilities that we have.
So it's interesting because even the idea of evolution is hard for me to keep all together in my mind. So because we think of a human time scale, it's hard to imagine that like the development of the human eye would give me nightmares too. Because you have to think across many, many, many generations. And it's very tempting to think about kind of a growth of a complicated object. And it's like, how is it possible for that such a thing to be built? Because also me, from a robotics engineering perspective, it's very hard to build these systems. How can, through an undirected process, can a complex thing be designed it seems wrong.
Yeah. So that's absolutely right. And a slightly different career path that would have been equally interesting to me would have been to actually study the process of embryological development flowing on into brain development and
Yeah.
the exquisite sort of laying down of pathways and so on that occurs in the brain. And I know the slightest bit about that. It's not my field, but there are, fascinating aspects to this process that eventually result in the complexity of various brains. At least, one thing we're in the field, I think people have felt for a long time. It in the study of vision, the continuity between humans and non-human animals has been second nature for a lot longer. I had this conversation with somebody who's a vision scientist, and he was saying, "Oh, we don't have any problem with this. The monkey's visual system and the human visual system are extremely similar." Up to certain levels, of course, they diverge after a while. But the visual pathway from the eye to the brain and the first few layers of cortex or cortical areas, I guess one would say, are extremely similar.
So, as the child, actually, I might cut this into two videos. I was just thinking because Evie's gonna be home from school soon. I hope it's not annoying for the students if I do it as two parts instead of just one long video, because then I could get this ripped up and then keep working on the rest tonight. But we'll kind of see how it goes here. This is an interesting point from brain development. Okay, so remember where this is situated. We're not just talking about how infants sleep in general. We're situating this within a neuroconstructivist brain development discussion and saying that actually this increased tendency of infants to sleep, especially newborns, most of their time, the fact that infants are spending like half of their sleep time in dream, they're in REM longer, rapid eye movement longer. They drop into it quicker, right? Meaning like when they both go to bed and go back to sleep, it doesn't take them as long to reach these deep sleep REM cycles as it does for me or you. In contrast, so I just read that stat, right? So infants spend half their time in REM sleep. They often begin their sleep cycle with REM rather than a non-REM cycle. In contrast, adults spend about a fifth of their night in REM sleep. So the difference between you and an infant is the infant spending about a half of their night in this deep REM dreaming mind, whereas you only spend about a fifth, right? So it's a difference between 50% and 20%. Probably didn't need to say that, but by the time the infant reaches 3 months of age, the percentage of time they spend in REM decreases to about 40%. And REM sleep no longer begins the sleep cycle. So think about this, as the baby gets older, then not only do they start to take time to drop into REM, which is more typical of older brains, but they start to spend a little bit less time. So the flip of that is very interesting. Why would evolution be prioritizing REM sleep for babies so much, is the question, I think. And I think the answer to that has to be, if you're assuming that there's any kind of rhyme and reason to it, which there is with an evolutionary perspective for almost everything. Evolutionary things are very expensive. For you to be unconscious and unable to protect yourself for basically a third of your day for your entire life. If dreaming, which causes body paralysis and makes you incredibly vulnerable to predators, especially in the evolutionary past, comes at an incredible cost. If that didn't have tremendous benefit associated, evolution would have gotten rid of that a long time ago. And the idea is that we were dreaming way before we were talking. Seems like dreaming is fundamentally related to brain development in infancy, and related to basically everything else too. As a side note, we're going to end this course with the presentation on dreams, but specifically touching on it here because of its link to brain development. Okay, so I might stop here, and if I do, I'll catch you in part 2. Awesome class. See you soon.